have them on the experts in the field of Tennessee Williams on the stand to answer and talk about a couple of questions. So I'll sort of just put them on the table for you. Dr. Saddik, in your book, The Politics of Reputation, you essentially divide Williams' work into 3 phases of classifications. The first one you call theatricalist realism and includes his earlier plays like Glass Menagerie. The second phase you call experimental or anti-realistic, which is his work during the 1960s, 70s, and includes plays such as In the Bar of the Tokyo Hotel. And the third phase you call weak dramatic experiments, which is a kind of return to realism and includes the Red Devil Battery sign, amongst others. So we'd like you to sort of expand on these categories and tell us a little more about them in terms of style, content, and any significant connections to Williams' biography.
Okay, well, I think it's important to remember that these categories all fall into each other. They're not necessarily mutually exclusive. So the first category that I put his plays into were the most popular plays: Cat on a Hot Tin Roof, Streetcar Named Desire, Glass Menagerie, Night of the Iguana, Summer and Smoke, all the plays that most people would have heard of. And they were essentially realistic plays in the sense that they had plots, they had recognizable characters, they had a development and revelation of truth at the end, and so people could recognize something in themselves in these plays. It was a slice of life, what we call in realism a slice of life, somebody's life put on the stage. Like, popular movies are like that too. They're what we call realistic. The second phase of plays that I talk about in the book that I call experimental or anti-realistic was more in keeping with the plays of the 60s and 70s that were being done by playwrights such as Edward Albee, beginning in 1959 with The Zoo Story and other plays of that nature, the Living Theater, the Open Theater, and that explosion in the 60s of plays that were not following certain plots. They were not using recognizable characters. They were more often symbolic, poetic. It didn't have recognizable characters in the sense that the characters often didn't have names. They weren't supposed to represent human beings, complex human beings. They were just symbols. There was a lot of physical action as opposed to storytelling. And Williams' plays do that as well in the 60s and 70s, but they weren't well received. They didn't do very well. Because the public had gotten used to Williams doing basically realistic plays. It's also important to keep in mind, before I go on to the third category, that the first category of the popular plays was never really dramatic realism in its purest sense. The Glass Menagerie, if you know that play, has a narrator. It has narrated scenes narrated from memory. So Thomas serving in the play The Glass Menagerie as both narrator and character. So Williams was always interested in an anti-realistic kind of style. He just moved into it a little more in the 1960s and 70s when it became more acceptable. Later in his career, Williams was very disturbed by the negative critical reception that his plays received, the experimental plays, and so he tried to return to realism. And a lot of these plays, his heart wasn't in it, so a lot of these plays are just weak attempts at realism. Some of them are fine, but they're very basic. They're not very interesting. With a play like A Lovely Sunday for Kerr, for example, that he did in the late 70s, he tried to revive a streetcar named Desire type of plot and idea. He has a romantic heroine who wants to live for love, but she doesn't find it, so she has to compromise. But it just wasn't the same. He just couldn't do it. And so those are the 3 basic categories that I put the plays into in the book. And as far as biography, he was changing in the 60s and 70s. Williams was getting older. The theater was changing. And so, as a playwright, he started moving into what was more popular and what was being the exciting things that were being done in Europe and the United States.
So then, my next question for you is where you see Small Craft Warnings fitting into this body of work?
Yeah, Small Craft Warnings is an interesting play because it's technically a later play. It's 1972. And it grew out of a shorter play, a one-act called Confessional, which you can see when there's a spotlight on each of the characters, it's their moment of confession. And so Williams expanded that play after it was very well received in a run in Maine to to a longer play in 1972 that ran off Broadway. It's not a realistic play in the traditional sense. It doesn't have a beginning, middle, and end. It doesn't have an exposition or an explanation in the beginning and a series of climaxes and contradictions, and then get revealed, that all gets settled in the end. The characters are not very complex. We don't delve into their psychology, we don't delve into a domestic situation, but it's not a completely anti-realistic play. There is a semblance of plot. We do get to feel identification with the characters, which is a central component of realistic playwriting. It's a central component of realism. In anti-realistic plays, for example, if you've seen things that are very abstract, you're not meant to connect with the characters at all. There are barely any characters to connect with. So if you're connecting or identifying, there's some element of realism there. And I think one of the reasons that this play was successful, much more successful than a lot of his other work of the 60s and 70s, is because of that emotional content. And because of the fact that there is confession. And we like that as audiences. We like to experience that sort of confession, to be eavesdroppers and voyeurs in people's lives. So I think that's one of the reasons that it was more successful than the plays of the 60s and 70s. And as far as where it fits in, I call it one of the anti-realistic experimental plays, but it was a little more realistic than some.
And so that's why it was better received.
I think so.
You begin your book with a wonderful quote that he compares critics to a mugging, right?
Yes. Well, this is a great story. In 1979, Williams was walking down the street in Key West with his friend, and they were jumped by a group of thugs. Now, they were asking for it, essentially. They were walking down. They were walking down the street and saying,
the play?
No, they were not asking for the beating, but they were goading and asking for trouble. They were singing Southern hymns. And they saw these thugs on planters, hanging around.
That deserves a beating.
They saw these thugs hanging out, and then they asked them if they'd like to hear a hymn. Now, it doesn't deserve a beating, but they were, poking and prodding when they saw dangerous characters. And these guys were just kind of thug-like, and so they beat up Williams and his friend, which was not obviously deserved in that way. But Williams was not. He was not scared. And so
And he was like 68 years old.
yeah, he was not, he was not running away, and he was actually,
Trying to fight back.
yeah. And when they asked him, when his friend wanted to run away, he said, my name is Tennessee Williams, and I am not in the habit of retreat. He was very strong about this. And so, they got their beating, and everybody dispersed, and everything was over. And when his friend asked him who he thought the thugs were who beat them up, he said, "Baby, they were probably New York drama critics." And, yeah.
Many of Williams' lesser-known works, which were poorly received in their own time, are finally coming to our attention, being published, seeing productions, and thanks to you guys in particular. And so I'm curious for you to weigh in on why audiences are more prepared to take these plays seriously now, why we can enter them in a new way. And for you, Mr. Keith, to weigh in on which of the plays do you help decide go into a published collection? How does that work?
Well, one thing I was going to say when you're talking about where small craft warnings fits in, and it really is a hybrid. Williams is often quoted as saying at one point in the 60s that he was done with the big works. From now on, he was going to do chamber pieces. And small craft warnings is a chamber piece with these. With all these little sort of mini plots within it, and not having a larger plot, and having the characters isolated and so forth. But I was also thinking while we were watching it today that in 1972, for Williams, he was showing really a dark end of humanity.